Yeah, okay. Welcome everybody. I'm very happy to open the concluding session of the workshop, which will be dedicated to to a broader look at the role of LDH studies and linguistic dating in the discourse of biblical scholars. The discussion in this session will be less formal. We have a panel of three scholars, and I also hope that we have plenty of time for a discussion with many colleagues and other participants that we see in the audience. And I will begin by presenting our three honorable panelists. Alexander Prof, an emeritus professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, is internationally acclaimed for his many contributions to all aspects of biblical research. He has published extensively on Deuteronomy, the prophetic narratives, Jeremiah, Trito Isaiah, and other corpora. His introduction to the Bible has become a standard reference work in the Hebrew scholarship. His studies touch upon core topics of biblical criticism, including many papers dedicated to the dating of various passages and strata in biblical literature that stress the need to integrate the issue of dating within a historically informed outlook of ancient Israel. Ron Handel is the Norma and Sam Daby Emeritus Professor of Hebrew Bible and Jewish Studies at University of California, Berkeley. He is the co-author of How Old is the Hebrew Bible, a linguistic, textual, and historical study, a book that has been mentioned several times during the last days, and has written many other books and articles on various aspects of the Hebrew Bible. For instance, the book of Genesis, biblical criticism, and many other topics. He is general editor of the grand project, the Hebrew Bible, a critical edition. Noam Mizrahi is the chair of the Department of Bible and the director of the Orion Center for the Study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Associated Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research explores the intersection between historical linguistic analysis of ancient Hebrew, text-critical investigation of biblical texts, and the compositional history of biblical and post-biblical literature. His first monograph, Witnessing a Prophetic Text in the Making by the Goiter 2017, studied the case of Jeremiah 10 in light of these converging lines of development. His second book, A No Commentary on Pesher Chavakuk from Qumran, will soon be published by the Israel Museum Press. Thank you to all three of you for participating. And I will now share a very short presentation. As a starting point for this panel, it may be useful to briefly refer to the place of dating within the discussion of biblical scholars, and also to some dating methods common in biblical studies. So, of course, dating is traditionally considered a key issue for almost any biblical exploration, and the critical study of the Bible has always, so to speak, aspired not only to identify separate sources in the text, but also to establish them historically, to build a chronological framework to describe Israelite intellectual history, theological history, etc. I think that there is a consensus on the ambition, but the methods used to achieve it are not as consensual. Scholars have used a variety of ways to date biblical texts, and here are really some few examples. So, for example, using parallel material from ancient Near East, that is to say, if we find, for instance, a patriarchal legal convention that accords with Mesopotamian legal materials, some scholars will argue that they come from the same time. Associating passages from non-historic genres, for example, prophecy, with events known from biblical historiography. And of course, creating evolutionary models that reconstruct the development of religious institutions. That would be, I think, true for some versions of the documentary hypothesis. Models that describe the development of texts and genres. So for instance, maybe form criticism. And I would like to borrow some examples from the programmatic paper by one of our panelists, Alexander Rofe, titled לא על הלשון לבדה, תיארוך פרשיות שבמקרא לפי השיטה הפילולוגית-היסטורית, published in לשוננו, 2012. And Rofe mentions several criteria and means for dating, and I only mentioned two of them. The Archimedean point of the centralization of worship that he uses not only for the dating of Deuteronomy, but also for the dating of several narratives across the Bible. And he also mentions the social conventions that may contribute to dating, for example, mohar. And to these, we may add similar data suggested by other scholars from the realm of realia. For example, very famous issues, the domestication of camels, of course, names of nations and places, like Ur Kasdim mentioned in a short discussion between me and Ron 2 days ago, Plishtim mentioned in the book of Genesis, Tarshish, Pul, Velud in 3rd Isaiah. This is another example mentioned by Rofe for the dating of 3rd Isaiah. And these are, of course, only a few examples. Not all of these considerations have the same weight, so to speak, and not all of them are equally accepted by all scholars. However, many of the conclusions they yield are considered axiomatic in many academic circles. The linguistic dating was developed to some degree separately from these other methods, mainly by Hebraists. I do not have time for history of scholarship, but you can see some of the main road signs on the slide, including a hint to the recent debate about the validity of the method, which I prefer at this stage to leave as a hint. So of course, many of these authors are also Bible scholars. And of course, the linguistic method did become part of the discourse of biblical scholars, but I would say that not fully so. And if I'm to generalize, I may say that when the linguistic method shows that something is post-exilic, these conclusions are more easily accepted and become part of the discussion than in cases when it concludes that a text is pre-exilic. And maybe later we will discuss whether the method is at all capable of indicating that something is pre-exilic. This is a different issue. I think that maybe this is why the latest book by Houston and Handel that you can see on the slide has gained so much interest, not only for its obvious importance on its own right, but also because it attempts to close this gap, which is still around, it's still with us. So with this, I would like to present the first topic or the first question that I would like to address to our panelists. And this is, to what extent can we refer to the linguistic method as a relatively more empirical or at least better based tool compared to other means used for dating biblical texts? And perhaps more importantly, how should we deal with cases in which the two methods arrive at different conclusions? A typical example would be the dating of P, when the priestly source. When the discussion uses non-linguistic arguments, scholars debate whether it is pre-exilic or post-exilic, and there is vast acceptance of the later date from Wellhausen to this day. But when we look at the linguistic evidence, the majority of it shows that it is pre-exilic, and perhaps there are a few pieces of evidence that show otherwise. This is also debated. So how should we prioritize the various types of arguments and evidence? I think that would be the first question, and maybe we will ask Professor Rofe to begin.
Thank you. Well, if I may, I would like to mention that that article published in Hebrew on Leshonenu was published also later in the memorial volume to Timo Vejora, the Finnish scholar who passed away a few years ago. It is a memorial volume published by the Academy, the Finland Academy of Sciences, and also, I think, in conjunction with a publishing house from Göttingen. Yeah, now what I would like to try to add to this colloquium is especially the fact that it seems to me we have to try and find out how things are judged in other fields. Especially, I think about late Latin in Europe, how such productions in late medieval times were identified by scholars. And it seems to me it is possible to find out expressions that do not occur in ancient classical Latin and appear in the late one. Perhaps something of that kind could be done also with Greek. The difference between classical Greek and Byzantine Greek. I believe the analogy from other classical languages that still were used in later times can be instructing, can instruct us about the proceedings that we are adopting about in the history of the Hebrew language, classical Hebrew vis-a-vis late Hebrew. I hope I made myself clear. I don't know. This is one point. Another point is, if I'm not mistaken, Ron, in one of his articles mentioned the resilience. And in this, I understand the main point is the fitness that one can find between a late late language and historical circumstances that are that are either mentioned or assumed by a late piece. Up to here, I think I would say, and I will appreciate if you react to these points.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll move to Ron.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Yeah, let me just preface my comments by thanking Nili for putting this together and for Ronit for organizing it. This has been a delightful conference, and I want to say that it seems to me that the way to get from where we are to where we would like to be, and that is to have biblicists and linguists in conversation with each other, is precisely what Nili has put together here. This has been such a feast for the mind and such a interest. Everybody's paper I've learned things from, and it shows how vital this kind of area is and how interesting it is to think and to explore, and the kinds of discussions, the kinds of debates, the kinds of, the way that people react to each other. This is an exciting field. And I think that the lack of engagement by biblical scholars in this field, in this subfield, which is so important for biblical studies, as Alex has said and written about eloquently, can only be resolved by kind of showing how exciting this stuff is. It's not a fixed structure that biblical scholars have to just sort of swallow and change all their minds, change all their views. It's a conversation, okay? And it's a conversation by people who know a lot and who are interested in this stuff. And so I think this kind of forum is the best way forward. The question is how to rope in the biblical scholars, and for that I have no real answer. But I think that the subtitle for this particular section, Conversation of Biblicists and Linguists, is precisely what we need to facilitate and to encourage, and to not live in our separate little ghettos, as it were. In thinking about this topic, I returned to an old book by C.P. Snow. I'm in England right now, so I'm only going to cite English people. C.P. Snow wrote this book called The Two Cultures, about how people in science and the humanities simply don't understand each other. They talk past each other, if we can use that kind of Kuhnian language, and they don't value each other. Now, this was in England in the 20s, where humanists, I mean, if you were a classicist, you didn't care about physicists and stuff. So we have a little different perspective, but it's only different insofar as now science is the prestige inquiry and humanities are peripheral. So my question is, why is it that we have two cultures within the humanities, within the field of biblical studies? Because we do. Most biblical scholars who are interested in questions of dating biblical texts or determining the relative chronology of different biblical strata, these are people who do source criticism, redaction criticism, who are interested in supplementation, Fortschreibung. This is a whole inquiry of itself. And I would note that it's primarily located in theology faculties, where linguistics of Hebrew is simply not taught. So there's an organization, there's a kind of discursive and organizational structure that makes this a different culture. The culture of people who do this kind of dating of biblical texts, for the most part, they live in a discursive and institutional world where Hebrew linguistics is not part of the conversation. Okay, you don't have these things taught in theology faculties for the most part. You have to you know, go to Jerusalem to study this, as I'm looking at around me at some of the people who have learned this by going to Jerusalem. And it's similarly, it's this case in Europe, it's this case in England, it's this case in the US. You simply have a different culture. So Hebraists do wonderful things, but it doesn't reach the ears of biblicists because they're in a different box, a different category, a different institution. So theology. So this is the distinction between theology and philology. Okay, and let me say both of those are shrinking, are being supported less and less, and it behooves us to, in this time of increasing marginalization of these fields, to talk to each other. But there are these, institutional and discursive distinctions that create these two cultures that simply don't talk to each other. So we need to talk. Now, on some of these methodological questions that Nili has asked, I mean, this is where these differences hit where in America, as we say, it's where the rubber hits the road, okay? If people say linguistics are not relevant for dating biblical texts, you have to ask, why do people say that? And if we say that linguistics are relevant, or even more empirical, I mean, to go to Nili's question, is this a more empirical method for determining relative or absolute dates? On what criteria do we argue this? And so this is some of the stuff where people say, where people have an opportunity, I think, to have a conversation. In some sense, we have data in the study of the Hebrew language. We have inscriptions, we have different languages, we have different identifiable language stages, we have dialects, we have linguistic changes over time, we have language contact, all the different things that Ohad was pointing out earlier. There are real things out there, and even archaeological things that are relevant for us. So there is a certain empirical density that we can claim for linguistic studies. On the other hand, as historical linguists will always tell us, well, and this is something my teacher Thomas Lambden used to say, we're really working with no data. Now, he was exaggerating. We have some data, but we're working with a very small, selective, and kind of clumped bodies of data. And we just we can't go as a modern linguist would to a speaking community and find out how dialects change from place to place or from one generation to another, or study language contact. So our data set is very impoverished, okay? And we have to just recognize that. On the other hand, we do have data, okay? And so for people who are biblical scholars doing source criticism and doing history of literature, one of the challenges that Joosten and I tried to make is that you can't ignore this stuff, okay? And we wanted one of the things that we wrote this book for was to package the current consensus, or make a sort of advance it in some small ways in a package that was accessible to biblical scholars, understandable to biblical scholars. So they couldn't just ignore it by saying, I'm not going to read these specialized publications. I don't know if we had any success in doing so because, well, because I'm a pessimist. But this was what we tried to advance, to make this knowledge available in a readable and kind of synthetic way so that this discussion could be entered into. Now, on the other side, some of our critics say that on the one hand, we really don't know that much, and for that I agree. They also say that different linguists disagree with each other. Okay, Ian Young and some of his colleagues say, no, these are not successive stages of the language, but they're synchronous dialects. And so a lot of times I hear people say, well, if the linguists disagree with each other, why should we pay attention to the whole thing at all? And that's kind of an easy escape, but it is something that people say, and I think that's methodologically weak, but it's a way that gives people an excuse not to engage with the primary data at all. The other main way that the source critics will say linguistics is irrelevant for the different strata that they isolate is by saying that, as Nili said, people in the late period, why couldn't they have just emulated classical and done a wonderful job doing so, so that we can't say definitively that something that is in classical biblical Hebrew was written earlier than the period of late biblical Hebrew, was written in the pre-exilic period, let's say. This is a complicated argument because I think emulation is a very important thing about what's going on in much of the biblical corpus. I think, Steve has written quite nicely in one of his articles saying that much of late biblical Hebrew is indeed emulation of classical biblical Hebrew. And therefore, and I think this is consonant with some of the things Ohad was saying earlier today, they're emulating the classical language, okay? There's also other influence going on, but this is a major thing. So I think the inquiry into the extent to which the classical language is being emulated here in late biblical Hebrew and in Qumran Hebrew, because as we saw earlier, there's different degrees of emulation. In some ways, the Qumran Hebrew shows a greater attempt, or even a more successful attempt, to emulate classical Hebrew. So I really think the study of this idea of emulation, if we can refine that, that would be a bridge on which we can help to build this conversation. But if late biblical Hebrew is to a large degree emulation of classical Hebrew, this not only accepts the argument of, let's say, the continental source critics, but if we can refine it, then I think this is a kind of point where we can possibly reach some consensus. That is to say, if we find that emulation is successful in certain areas, let's say lexicon, but not as successful in other areas, let's say syntax, which I think is true, then I think that can allow us to make a little bit more progress in getting some sort of consensus. So I really appreciate that this conference was about the syntax of late biblical Hebrew, because I think that's a much more substantive way. So get back to my English example, I can emulate Shakespeare by saying words like bodkin, okay? But I have no clue about how to emulate Shakespeare's syntax. It's at a much deeper level of, deep structure of a language, and it's just harder to emulate. So I could parrot Shakespeare by using the lexicon, but I just couldn't do the deeper language. So these are the sorts of things that I would hope we could make some progress on. They're vague, they're large, but I think we certainly, this conference has shown we have the intellects and we have the erudition to do this. And that's the sort of thing that I think would be an exciting step forward that would help this conversation. Otherwise, I think we're just stuck on these two different cultures that just ignore each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nam, would you like to respond?
Well, there's already a long list of points to respond to, but of course I won't be able to respond to everything. Perhaps I'll just start.
A short comment. The last thing that Ron responded to, I was going to ask later, so you can postpone it if you want.
This was exactly what I was going to do. But perhaps to touch base again with three, I think, key terms that you, Nili, said at the beginning. And by the way, I have to, again, to start perhaps by seconding Ron's beautiful summing up of everything. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, this has been tremendously enriching workshop, and I enjoyed it. I learned from all papers. I disagreed with some of them, but I mean, they were thought-provoking as well, which is very important because it's really by disagreement, I think, that the field moves forward, because it forces us to sharpen our own thinking, and sometimes perhaps to rethink some older positions. And as many of you know, I have this split personality, namely that I feel at home in the same way, or as alienated in the same way in both linguistics and biblical studies. So I hope that what I'm going to say will be understood in this context, namely that I'm emphatic to both disciplines. So three notions that I would like to comment on briefly. One is empirical, the other one is better based, and the third is method. So perhaps I'll start with empirical. And because I have some experience in working with scientists as well, especially life sciences, I have now, I think these days, I have a better sense of what is empirical, and if a key notion or a key concept for the definition of something as empirical would be that it can be replicated in an independent experiment. I'm not entirely sure that historical linguistic analysis is really complies with this definition of empirical. In theory, it should be able to do that. I mean, and I think Alex's reference to the Greek evidence and the Latin evidence really fits into this picture. But the difference is that with the Greek and the Latin corpora, we have huge amount of textual and inscriptional evidence, which is very often well dated. So if a new inscription is discovered and it is dated, we can really test some hypothesis about the development of Latin and Greek. This, however, is not the case with Hebrew. I mean, at least for the time being, the non-biblical or extra-biblical evidence is so meager, and its dating so often depends on wider historical considerations and archaeological considerations that really cannot be, we're not able to test our hypothesis. So in theory, yes, I mean, our method, the linguistic methods should be empirical, more empirical than others, but in practice, I don't think it really works. So I think we have to have some humility when we're taking this unfortunate fact into account. This brings me to the notion of, or the words that use better based. Again, I mean, in theory, perhaps, but in reality, I'm not so sure. And the reason why I'm not so sure that the linguistic tools are better based, don't misunderstand me. I think they're well-based, but are they better based? Here, I'm not so sure. And the reason for that is that I don't think we as linguists, or under my hat of a linguist, I don't think we always acknowledge the degree to which we really depend on non-linguistic considerations that underlie our research questions. And I'll give just two examples. One, I think, which was aptly addressed in many papers of this workshop, was the textual evidence. I think in a number of papers, we saw very clearly how a change in the textual basis, namely when one moves from the Masoretic text to other textual witnesses, can change the historical linguistic profile of a certain, or evaluation of a certain textual unit. And I think this is very important, but this is not always taken into account. I think all too often many analysis depend solely on the Masoretic text and don't always take into account that this is just one of many other witnesses. Of course, it's the most convenient one to work on. And very often this is the only one which is fully extant. So we're compelled to use it. But this does not necessarily mean that when we describe the language of a certain biblical text, what we describe is really the original composition. Not at all. I think very often we describe something whose linguistic or historical linguistic profile is quite different from the time of composition. And the other, I think, consideration that we even less acknowledge is the rather complicated compositional and redactional history of all these texts. I think that, for instance, it's very common to find analysis of books, let's say, okay? But, you know, to take a book like Zechariah and try to describe its language would be just as wrong as to try to describe the language of Isaiah. Because when we take the book of Isaiah, we take a textual unit which contain texts which are separated by many centuries. And this is exactly true for Zechariah as well, although some people haven't, you know, acknowledged this fact as easily. And this is true even for the other texts, like the Book of Kings. The Book of Kings is a composite work with the source documents and later redactional strata, and we can't simply take it at face value, I think. And I think this is, and when we do take it at face value, we actually describe an entity which is a composite one. And we have to be very aware of this fact. So again, this is why I think that our methods are well-based, but not better-based, because not always we take account of these factors. And the last key notion that I would like to comment on is the notion of dating, or method, sorry, dating method. And here I would like again to make a sort of a skeptical voice. Perhaps I'm the bad guy in this conversation here. I'm taking the role of the devil's advocate, just to provoke my esteemed colleagues. I think that dating texts or biblical texts or any text is not a method in itself. I think this is really a practical application, and but the actual theoretical background of which is not in what we call dating biblical texts. It's rather in the realm of historical linguistics. So we really have to understand historical linguistics, and especially the key processes that govern linguistic change. And only then can we try to at least make an application by actually dating particular texts. But the problem is that many of the people, and I include myself here, I mean, it's not always that I have been so aware of the theoretical background. And I think that within the confines of biblical scholarship, the awareness of the broader theoretical background of this application is not well spread. And I think we really have to look into the broader theory before we apply something on particular texts. And we have much to learn again. And here perhaps I can only second Alex's comment from earlier. I think in this regard too, the evidence from Greek and Latin is very instructive, as from other languages. But again, we're limited by the evidence that we have, and the evidence is really quite limited. And perhaps one final comment, but only if Nili allows me, because I think I already overstretched.
Of course. No, you're allowed.
About P. The P I mean, P is quite close to my heart for all sorts of reasons. But I think P is quite a good example for how sometimes the way we frame the question really conceals some problematic presuppositions. I think, and as some of you know, Avi Hurwitz was my Dr. Vater, so I can't be blamed of not being part and parcel of the Jerusalem school in this regard. But I think that Avi's very important work, by the way, which will remain a classic for many years. I mean, even if I'm going to sound, again, some dissenting voice there now, but Avi's analysis is based on a certain presupposition that P is a document. And this was very common at the time. I mean, if you read carefully his footnotes, you will see that he deals with this problem. But actually, nevertheless, the assumption is that P is a document. but I'm not sure that this is a correct definition. I don't think that P is a document that can be dated. I think P is a designation of a textual corpus which is quite variegated. It's really a literature with various strata, not just P and H in Knoll's method, and not just PG and PS in the older designation, but rather a multi-layered literature, some of which is self-contained, some of which is depends on other texts, non-priestly texts. And if we lump everything together, we're bound to make a mistake in terms of the historical linguistic profile of this textual corpus. So I think that the way to move forward, and I don't want to leave everyone with the feeling that I don't think that there is any way to move forward. The way to move forward is on a case by case. We need to investigate case by case, try to be as subtle as we can with our textual and literary distinctions, and then we can apply historical linguistic analysis or trying to make a profile of it, a diachronic profile. So I think perhaps a way to wrap it up is to refer again to what Ron said. I think collaboration and conversation between biblicist and linguist is really the way to move forward, because no one can really now master everything, all these, the subtleties of all these disciplines, but we have to be very aware of the presuppositions that we have on both sides, by the way, not just on the linguistic side. I think also literary critics have all sorts of presuppositions that they would not easily admit about the language. Ron referred to some of these, but maybe this is better left to the discussion of emulation.
Thank you very much. So maybe Harold is clapping. I'll continue with this discussion of emulation that Ron had already mentioned. And this is something that I would like to take several minutes to explain, because the question the way I would like to phrase it is somewhat specific. So in my view, the strengths of the method of linguistic dating depends on the problem of unidirectionality. If we assume that the method is unidirectional, it means that if a text has a clear late feature or late features, then it can safely be dated as late. But if it lacks late features, it cannot safely be dated as early. And the reason being that later scribes were familiar to a varying degree with CBH and basically used it as the basis of their writing. Some scholars would say that the most gifted among them were capable of imitating CBH flawlessly and exactly. And if that is true, then only the dating of a given text as pre-exilic can be potentially refuted by linguistic data. But dating of any text as late does not have to subject itself to the linguistic test. So, and I think it is not a coincidence that scholars who attempted to show that the text is early on linguistic grounds, and here I hint again at Horwitz in his very impressive study of the priestly source, they had to develop more sophisticated ways to compensate for that problem. And here is the alternative. So other scholars would say that a perfect imitation of CBH by later scribes is impossible. And later writing would always give itself away. And just like Ron said before, in the smallest details, so if not on the obvious lexical level, on the subtle syntactic level. So if that is the case, then the method works both ways. It's not unidirectional. And therefore it is much more powerful and more prone to clash with other means of dating. This problem, of course, has direct bearing on the ability to use the linguistic method for judging dating achieved by alternative methods. And this is what I would like to open for discussion. You can just jump in, whoever of you who wants to comment first. Ohad, I promise you that we'll have plenty of time for more broader discussion. We are really very interested in everybody's opinion on that, because so many experts of the field are here.
Maybe I can comment on what Ron said earlier. And again, I mean, Ron put it in this notion of emulation or mimicking an older language system. I think, well, here I think my position is really actually very simple and straightforward. Unlike the most subtle way I was trying to illustrate earlier, I think full emulation is totally impossible. But here, perhaps I think some caution should be exercised. A particular element can be emulated, okay? A late author, I think, can emulate, can use old lexemes, can try to employ a particular archaic grammatical feature or even a syntactical construction. The problem is that we have to look on the entire system. And the complexity of linguistic and paralinguistic elements which are involved in determining the language system of any given point in time, I mean, the number of factors is so immense and their interaction is so complicated. And this results in the inability to emulate the entire language system. So particular elements can be emulated, but it's their reciprocal interaction with each other which cannot be emulated. This is why I think, and now I go back to my simpler starting point, that really full emulation is bottom line is impossible. And this is, I think, again, a presupposition. Here there is, I think, a presupposition of many biblical scholars, which perhaps is ingrained in the theological disciplinary context that Ron mentioned earlier, because, you know, but this is perhaps not singular to theologians. I think that perhaps the practice of many Western universities to teach and compose in Latin until the early 20th century made some people think that they can actually emulate classical Latin. Although if one takes this Latin dissertation written in the 19th century, I don't think that Cicero would approve it in terms of its Latin. So I think it's really impossible to emulate, and this is why influence from an earlier strata of the language is definitely possible, but it cannot be replicated in its entirety. Having said that, I do think, and I think Naama has written about that and Jan has written about that, that we can also mount some positive evidence for dating early texts. I don't think it's entirely a matter of its own unidirectional in the sense that it can only date late text. We can also try to compile a profile, a historical linguistic profile of early texts. But again, we have to be aware that the external evidence that we have to test our hypothesis is very meager. So I would say that the further back in time we go, the more, I would say, hypothetical our profile is. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. We just have to be aware that it's much more, it becomes more and more difficult. But I don't think we're really limited to only the late or evidence for late dating. Late here, of course, when we say early and late, we mean pre-exilic and post-exilic. But there are, again, here I think we might do some more subtle distinctions, and I think the scheme of Avi Hurwitz has dominated the field for a long time, but we also had Frank Pollock speaking yesterday, and he developed a different scheme. I mean, we can debate about it, but he at least attempted to make a more subtle distinction between, which doesn't really or entirely correlate with the CBH, TBH, LBH system. We need to take this, I think, theory into account too.
Thank you. Alex or Ron, any of you would like to comment on that? Alex,
yes,
okay.
if I may, I would like to make two short notes about this business of emulation. One is information that I bring from my high school. I remember a high school teacher told us about our national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik. He claimed that he could emulate all styles of Hebrew, but for one, the style of the Ibn Tibon family. That, he declared, I cannot imitate at all. So probably he believed that he could emulate biblical style, but I don't know more details about that declaration of Chaim Nachman Bialik. Another point is my own experience in emulating biblical style. Once I had to write a letter of recommendation for a student to a colleague in Paris. And I said to myself, well, French, I cannot write. English, well, they are Anglophobes. So I will write biblical Hebrew, starting with the date. So what date you put? You put so-and-so, such a year to Geulat Israel, to the redemption of Israel, and so on. And I was satisfied, very nice. Finally, at the end, I found a fall. And the fall was this time not in syntax, I believe. It was in the semantics. I wrote about that student that she ended her studies. She finished her studies, Vatigmor. And I don't have to tell you that ligmor in the biblical corpus appears as a secondary form of ligmol, and is not at all the meaning that once was in modern Hebrew. Now it is no more there. In modern Hebrew now, ligmor has a sexual meaning. But anyway, my fall was in the semantics. And to this I would apply, if you allow me, to the method of my good colleague, Avi Hurwitz. He demanded that for declaring a text as late, you need an accumulation of evidence. And I would maintain you don't need any accumulation. You need one fall. The late scribe who knew by heart a lot of classical literature was able to emulate very nicely, and only once or twice he would make a fall, and in this way betray his late date. I hope you will accept this reservation.
Thank you. A very, very interesting story in itself. Ron?
Yeah, I think what Alex says is the right method. This is how I think he also mentioned in early modernity, people like Lorenzo Valla was determining that the donation of Constantine was a forgery because there were mistakes. There were things there were semantics, there were words that were used that didn't exist at the time of Constantine. So I think finding a good error in that respect is a wonderful, it's like a fingerprint of showing when the author lived. And if it's a good one, it's decisive. One more thing I'd like to say about the emulation, which I've tried to raise this with some of my colleagues, and they don't really appreciate this point. They don't like it when I raise this point. But if you have, for example, all of the non-P material in the Pentateuch, and I agree with Noam that the P is a corpus, not just a single stratum. But if you take the non-P material that conforms to what we think of as classical Hebrew, and if it's all post-P, then the argument that these are emulations of classical biblical Hebrew has a kind of mise en abîme. It kind of defeats itself because there's nothing to emulate. The more you ascribe to late emulation, the less there is for those people to actually emulate, to the point of there being nothing left. So classical biblical Hebrew, you have to have a big enough corpus to emulate, but the more you attribute to emulation, the smaller that corpus gets. So that's a methodological problem. One more thing I just wanted to say is that in Noam's lovely remarks, his attempt to take an opposition view, I think totally fails, because it's so reasonable. And I think this is an important point to make, that the linguistic dating of biblical texts, just to mimic what he said, is a practical application of the field of historical linguistics of Hebrew. And I think that's a very important distinction to make that many of our colleagues in biblical studies don't understand. They say, I don't believe in linguistic dating of biblical texts. Well, the question is, do you believe in historical linguistics of Hebrew? Because that's really the field, with all of its theoretical and empirical entailments and body of literature and evidence. That's really the field of which dating biblical texts is simply one practical application of. And I think distinguishing those two would be very helpful for people to realize, even if they somehow don't believe in dating biblical texts, it's still important for them to engage with the field of historical linguistics of biblical Hebrew.
Yeah, but can I just add a short comment here, that I think that we also need to acknowledge different agendas. So I think for biblical scholars, if Genesis 24 or 1 Kings 20 is a pre or post-exilic, this has very grave consequences. I'm picking, of course, examples that Alex has written about. It has very grave consequences for all sorts of historical, theological, literary reconstructions, which depend upon the dating of these texts. But I think we can make a quick survey. I don't know what the results would be. I think most linguists would sleep quietly regardless of the answer to this question, right? So because if you're trying to describe a language or a variety, a certain diachronic variety or chronolect, you would actually leave out the doubtful cases, right? You really would like to stick to the clear cases. So it's more important for biblical scholars to date biblical texts rather than for historical linguists of Hebrew. So we have to be aware of that some of these issues are more important in one field than, or in one perspective than the other, and hence the requirement of what we require from our colleagues in the other field should be adjusted accordingly.
Thank you very much. I think now is the time to let we have so many esteemed colleagues here who are working on the same material. So if you want to either comment or direct a question or a comment to one of the speakers, you're very welcome.
I'd like to just make a short comment about the difficulty of emulation of classical Hebrew. One always makes a mistake somewhere, as Alex pointed out and others. I'd just like to mention the forgeries of ancient inscriptions. In regard to classical biblical Hebrew, there's the Yoash forgery, where the forger was tripped up by the expression bedek bayit when he used the modern Hebrew semantics instead of the biblical semantics. So it's extremely difficult to get it right all the time. It's almost impossible.
I would say that this is empirical in the way Noam mentioned before, because he tried to replicate the, yeah, thank you, Ohad.
You're muted, Ohad.
Oh, thank you, Noam. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. I would like to say, starting with the fact that I'm considering myself Avi Horvitz, even though I criticized his model earlier, I consider myself his student, and I'm an historian and positivist. And I would like to say something regarding all the notes here today, and especially what Noam said. We all the time we have we consider ourselves linguistics, and we ask the question what we can contribute to the historical discussion. And many times we forget that as you said, Noam, our field is historical linguistics, and we forget the first half, history. And what I've tried to suggest today is that his history does leave tracks. And it's not only, one hint that we have in history. Regarding the historical model that I suggested earlier, I think each and every parameter, I'm not talking now about CBH versus LBH, but difference between First Temple period and Second Temple period. Each and every component is different in the historical framework. For example, no track for influence of Persian. This is very clear. But regarding also Aramaic influence, before 1743, the conquest of Tiglath-Pileser III to the west, no contact with Aramaic whatsoever. Why there will be a contact? People who are dwelling in Jerusalem with this weird Semitic dialect of the realm of Damascus. We don't see that in history. We don't see that in epigraphic. No evidence for the 8th century Aramaic in Jerusalem. So these evidence are very clear. Now, CBH is very important parameter during the Second Temple period because it became the canon. And as you all mentioned here today, the canon is very, very important. There are many research about the development of the canon of the Quran and how he changed. This is something that we have in much more details. Very important articles by Joshua Blau about the emergence of the Arabic canon and how it influenced the linguistic milieu of Arabic. So we don't have canon in the First Temple period. We almost don't have any Aramaic. The historical situation of the relationship between the different Canaanite dialects is completely different from the historical perspective. So I think that if we start from this historical framework and then ask ourselves, what do we see in text, and not trying to build historical picture from what we see in the text, this direction can be much more positive and we can be more sure. I'm not saying that, I completely agree with you, Noam, that the biblical text is a conglomerate. And modern, let's say, late biblical Hebrew can be inserted into archaic texts. But the historical situation is quite clear, and it is very, very, very different. The linguistic milieu of the First Temple period and the linguistic milieu of the Second Temple period, it is almost a completely different picture. And we should start from this and ask ourselves, where is the manifestation of this historical reality, which we have many evidence of. We cannot be sure in 100%, and the picture is not unified, as you all know. In each and every place, the situation is different. If I'm taking, for example, the private names in Elephantine, Aramaic, and the private names in Edomia, you can see two different, completely different communities. 16% of Persian name in Elephantine and less than 1% in Edomia. Aramaic, by the way, is equal in the two corpora. But what you see in Edomia is the Canaanite melting pot, and in Elephantine, almost all the names are Judean. So we have very different communities which represent very different historical situation. And I think that should be the starting point, and then we should ask ourselves, what do we see in the literary text?
Yes, but I would just say that, I mean, I would agree in principle, but I think that the historical context is as complicated. I mean, people in 330 didn't realize that they live in the Hellenistic period, because it was only 3 years after Alexander the Great just passed away through the land of Israel. So, and the same is true for the Assyrian conquest, etc. And I'm not sure that we need to confine ourselves to Jerusalem, for instance, when I think there is sufficient evidence that the Hebrew Bible also contains some texts that originate in the north. So I think, again, definitely the historical evidence must be taken into account, but it's not as clear-cut, I think, as we might assume.
Thank you. Other questions or comments, please? Nama.
I think there's regarding what Ohad said, I think there's a bit of a mistake from a historical linguistic point of view in assuming that even if we know the history of this area and what communities were in contact with each other, that there would be a linguistic evidence for that, or a linguistic result for contact. Different communities in different social situations react differently. And even we know from other areas, but also from our area, that even communities that lived very close to each other didn't necessarily influence in such a way as some scholars imply. So just because we know the history, and just because we know that there were, for example, Phoenician habitations in around the coastal area of Israel, that means that there was influence of Phoenician on Hebrew. That needs to be proven, not assumed. So going from history and saying, well, let's look for the evidence in the language, that's a mistake, because you will find it. If you look for influence of Phoenician on Hebrew, you will find it. Don't look for it. I mean, you have to be completely neutral when you come to these situations. And Ohad, you mentioned Arabic quite often. I think one thing that I learned recently is, for example, the assumption that there was very intense contact between Aramaic and Arabic after the occupation, the Muslim occupation of this region. And the facts is that if you look at the languages themselves, completely neutrally, there is almost no influence of Aramaic on Arabic, on the Arabic dialects of this area. But everybody assumes that because we know the history of this area, we should assume that there was this influence. So I think we have to be really, really cautious. And in fact, I would not contrary to what you said, I think we should look at every feature individually and look at what are the possibilities, what are the possible origins of these features. Yes, some of them may come due to contact, and some of them may be internal. And languages are like that. Sometimes they develop individually, and sometimes they take other, they absorb other features. But we have to go feature by feature and be super careful.
Thank you. Thank you, Naama. I think this continues the previous discussion. It's also a privilege that we have. Aaron Horncall would like to say.
Yeah, I would like to thank the three panelists for playing devil's advocate and devil's advocate and devil's advocate. One of the points that I think has been raised by everybody in some way, maybe most directly by Noam, and it's one that comes up over again and again, and in sometimes what I think is a very extreme way, and it might be a kind of easy way out for biblicists. I do agree that it is good in this. I've been very pleased in this colloquium that there has been an attempt by philologists, Hebraist linguists, to deal with the textual issues and even higher criticism and development of the text. I think that's very good, and I think that is the kind of the younger generation of scholars working in periodization have taken up that and have attempted to do that. I suspect sometimes biblicists look at some of our work and think that it's still in its infancy in that sense, but okay, we're trying. I'm not sure that the opposite is always happening. I'm not sure that the dyed-in-the-wool biblicists often take account of anything that's necessarily happening in our fields, and I think that's unfortunate. But one of the issues that they will bring up frequently is that the nature of the evidence, the transmitted nature of the biblical evidence, even just the Masoretic evidence, not to mention everything else, is so precarious and so unreliable that there's not much to say on the linguistic side. What can you say? So I'd like kind of a response from you all on that notion. I mean, my own kind of conviction on that is, well, if it's all so marshmallow, if the text is just completely unreliable, then you can't do philology, but you also can't do any kind of source criticism either, because it's just a mess. But I just wondered how you respond when scholars just point to the extreme fluidity of the text of all textual traditions.
Okay, any of you wants this one? Ron, please.
I'd be happy to take that. This is also an argument that I've come upon many times, not only about the impossibility of linguistic dating or determining the historical linguistics, but also of the impossibility of doing textual criticism. If everything is constantly in flow, then how can you adjudicate, or why would you even want to adjudicate within this endless, beautiful flow? And I think this is a reflex of a kind of postmodern dissatisfaction with historical scholarship and with philology in general. And also the fact that these courses are not offered in most graduate programs. People don't learn historical linguistics of biblical Hebrew. People don't learn textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. And so they latch onto a word like fluidity that Emmanuel Tove or Jean Ulrich will say, and they just surf on that as if this is in California. It's all fluid, and you can't say anything. But I think that's ultimately self-defeating, and I think it's also empirically wrong, because you can do textual criticism, you can do historical linguistics. One of the problems, and this goes to your methodological question too, why would you think you can do source criticism? Or why would you think you can do redaction criticism? Or why would you think you can do anything if the text is totally changeable? So what I find is that people have different levels of criteriology. That is to say, I will say that there are 12 strata in Genesis 27. And there's no real grounding for that except what I think is the case. But then they'll say historical linguistics is irrelevant because you can't prove it. Okay, or textual criticism is irrelevant because you can't prove it. Well, it's wrong to say the things you don't feel like doing, you can't prove and therefore are irrelevant, and then do completely subjective things yourself, which you also can't prove. So I think there's a kind of lack of methodological self-reflection that is often going on in this kind of war of methods that people think. Again, I would go back to what Alex was saying, that you need a consilience. You need to do all of these things and see how they interact together to get something that's a more or less reliable model for the text, simply because we do lack a lot of evidence. So you have to have a multi-layered approach.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to respond too? You have to open the mic, the microphone. Alex, אתה צריך לפתוח את המיקרופון שלך. יופי.
Thank you. No, I don't have anything else to add or to improve on what has been said.
Thank you. I'm sure you do, but you're just humble, so I'll turn to Noam.
I think, Aaron, you're absolutely right that the situation is not entirely even, and I think that even this colloquium has demonstrated that the current generation of people active in the field have been doing a lot of homework in terms of the especially the textual aspect of the evidence. And I agree with you that I would say the effort has not been fully matched from the other side as well. And as you know, I do think that early and late distinctions apply. I do think that a lot can be done, but I just think it has to be done with care and with finer distinction than what we're used to do. But having said that, I think we need to keep in mind one basic question. If all we had from the book of Isaiah was 1Q Isaiah A, or all that we have from the biblical historiography would be chronicles, so we wouldn't have access to kings and we wouldn't have access to the Masoretic text of Isaiah, would we be able to reconstruct properly the historical linguistic profile of, let's say, the earliest prophecies of Isaiah, or of earlier periods in the historiography of ancient Israel? I'm not so sure that this is the case. We really depend to a huge degree on the textual evidence we have and on the literary formation that they assume in a particular text. So what I think is simply that we're limited by the evidence, and we have to be fully aware of that. But we still, I think, philology, biblical philology, Hebrew philology, and classical philology have developed a range of analytical tools that allow us to penetrate into all sorts of strata of the text, but we simply have to look on them element by element, or layer by layer, or passage by passage, and try to describe them, and then to see how everything correlates or cohere into a bigger picture. Sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't happen, and then we have to explain that. So I'm just calling really for caution, not for total nihilistic approach.
Thank you. If anybody else has anything to say, I
think Adina raised the hand.
Adina, please do. Adina.
Yes, okay. The first thing I was going to say is very similar to Noam's last point with relation to the idea that a single word is enough to date a text as late. We know that texts did undergo evolution, and comparing Chronicles to Kings and comparing the Isaiah scroll to Isaiah shows that you can have a text that was written in one period and it acquires linguistic indications from a much later period. First of all, this whole conference has been absolutely wonderful, very illuminating and instructive and educational. I just had a comment on historical linguistics, which we're all talking about. I want to mention the title of a review article that Tanya Notarius wrote some time ago, entitled Historical Linguistics is Not Text Dating. I think part of the challenge that we're all facing here is that historical linguistics is really coming from the opposite direction. They're starting with texts where we know what historical period they come from, and we're trying to understand the direction and the kinds of changes that occur in time. And we're really doing the opposite. We're starting with texts that we don't know when they date from. So I think that really we're kind of inventing our own discipline here. And it's not surprising that not everybody agrees on the basic points of methodology, but I think that the field has made a tremendous amount of progress, and it's very, very promising. So thank you very much, Nili.
Thank you, Adina. Thank you. If anybody else has anything to comment.
If I may say something.
Tanya, please.
Just some short thing, that one of the problems in communication between linguists and non-linguists is, of course, technical terminology, the apparatus that linguists are sometimes used. And as Ron noticed correctly, usually biblical scholars are not trained for this apparatus. So I think that's there is a gap here that should be somehow overcome. And in my view, the biblical scholars have to pay more attention to linguistics the way they pay today more attention to archaeology. Actually, archaeology is also a separate field with its agenda and with its technical terminology and all other things, but biblical scholars have to be sensitive to archaeology. And something like this, in my view, should happen also concerning linguistics if biblical scholars want to use the advantages of linguistic methods in their work. And in this sense, I just want to make small promotion for our session at SBL that Aaron Horncourt and myself are running. And actually we see a lot of interest to linguistics and biblical Hebrew topics, all kinds of topics, not only historical linguistics and not only text dating, but all kind of heavy topics like syntax and semantics and others. Our sessions are very well attended, and we can notice that biblical scholars are interested in linguistics. So I think more cooperation of the kind that the workshop that you Nili arranged will be offered. It will do this job to improve the cooperation, to encourage the cooperation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for important words. If anybody wants to comment some more, some of the panelists or any of